ආචාර්ය ජයන්ත ධනපාල මහතාණනි ඔබටයි මේ වේදිකාව අමතන්න.
With the permission of the Mahasangha and representatives of the other religions here, Mr. President and members of the head table, I am both honored and privileged to share the platform with so many other representatives of professions and the legal fraternity in this People's Forum, which is a splendid initiative taken by you as custodians of the law in ensuring that the rule of law prevails in our country. I speak in my individual capacity, neither being a lawyer nor an academic, but I must say that nothing I say about militarization of our society detracts from my admiration of the military of Sri Lanka for having rid our country of terrorism. But it is 5 years almost since the end of the war against terrorism, and we still, unfortunately, see the prevalence of a military presence not only in the north and the east, but also in the south. I think it is important that we should have a sustainable peace and not the securitization of the state, which is what we see today. I worked under Kofi Annan in the United Nations, and Kofi Annan famously said, "There can be no security without development, and there can be no development without security, and there can be neither without human rights." Now, human rights, of course, encompasses the rule of law, and I think this is very much the vital pillar of a democratic society that should be there. The role of the armed forces is there both in war and in peace, but they are quite different in both places. The theory of war has been, of course, expounded by a number of philosophers, and in our own Asian continent we have the Chinese Sun Tzu talking about the art of war, and Kautilya or Chanakya talking about the way in which politics should be conducted in peacetime through the Arthasastra. We also had people in the West like Clausewitz talking about war being the extension of politics. And in the Charter of the United Nations, despite it being a body for the maintenance of peace and security, we do have elements where some degree of force is permitted. In self-defense, Article 51, and in the collective use of force under the Security Council in Chapter 7. But this is very different. The use of force in wartime, of course, is very different from the use of force in peacetime, particularly in a democratic society. We have the possibility of martial law, and it was introduced to our country by the British colonialists in 1915. But we have also had, since independence in 1948, emergency rule and the Prevention of Terrorism Act, under which a number of derogations of human rights take place. But these should be temporary until a situation ends. Unfortunately, we have had long periods of emergency rule which suspends the practice of human rights. And what we have today, particularly after the end of the terrorist war in 2009, is a rise in our defense expenditure. If you compare the budget allocation for the defense ministry in 2009 and today in 2014, you find a substantial increase which cannot be accounted for by inflation. Similarly, there is a substantial increase in the armed forces, the strength of the armed forces, which again cannot be explained. Now, the lessons learned and Reconciliation Commission, which was appointed by the President himself, has a number of very useful recommendations with regard to demilitarization. It says that it is important for us for normal civilian life to resume in the war-affected provinces, and there must be a visible demilitarization and a reversion to full civilian administration. An environment of fear and distrust is incompatible with reconciliation. And it also talks about the high security zones. Now, in contrast to these recommendations of the LLRC, you have the National Action Plan of the government, which has a website which attempts to record the progress made in implementing these recommendations. But we see in many of these cases that the recommendations are either ongoing in their implementation or not yet done. And this is what is being discussed in Geneva today. The fact that despite a resolution in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, which is the apex body in the United Nations for the discussion of human rights, we have no progress, no adequate progress in the recommendations of the LLRC being implemented. One particular case stands out, and that is the recommendation of the LLRC that the police should be separated from the other armed forces, from the administration of the Ministry of Defense. And so a Ministry of Law and Order has been created. But what happens is that that Ministry of Law and Order is headed by a retired Army general, whose language is the same language of the military. And there is no distinction between what the police are doing and what the military are doing. And a case in point, of course, was what happened in Valiveria. Now, I was for many years in the International Advisory Board of an organization in Geneva called the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. And that body grew up in the context of the post-Cold War situation in Europe, and particularly after conflicts in the Balkans, it engaged in the task of security sector reform. The key relationship in a democratic society is the importance of having a good civil-military relationship so that a healthy society can be created. Now, in this security sector reform, many of whose reports have been sent to the Ministry of Defense, the question is asked about the democratic civilian control of armed forces. The fact that there should be no ideological control by the military and that there should always be clearly civilian supremacy. And the example of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, which has a code of conduct, has been highlighted, where the importance of democratic civilian control of security forces is there. It obliges participating states to provide for democratic oversight of their armed and paramilitary forces, including intelligence forces, and obliges them to ensure that their armed forces remain politically neutral and to guarantee that the human rights of security personnel are respected. There are also UN standards with regard to security sector reform, and many regional bodies like the European Union, the African Union, and ASEAN have also highlighted the importance of these international standards, where civilian supremacy prevails over the military, where national security policies and defense planning are driven by civilians, and the appointment and dismissal of military commanders are subjected to decisions made by democratically elected civilians. I don't want to take up more of my time, but international law, I was asked to discuss the repercussions internationally of the situations here. International law began in Europe at a time when it was confined to relations among nations. But today, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with the number of human rights covenants adopted in Geneva in 1949. There are rules with regard to the conduct of war, and there are rules also with regard to civilians. And there is the ICCPR, where we have signed a number of the covenants, and we are bound by international law with regard to their observance. And so the record of Sri Lanka comes up from time to time, not only in the Universal Periodic Review once in 4 years, as happens with every country, including the United States, Russia, China, and India, and so on, but also with regard to particular issues like the rights of women, where we have a committee for the elimination of discrimination against women, where Professor Savitri Gunasekara was a member for many, many years, and in other areas like torture, disappearances, and so on. Now, unfortunately, although we have signed these and we have submitted reports, we have not been able to allow all the special rapporteurs to come to this country. And where they have come, their reports have reported a number of inadequacies with regard to the way in which we have adhered to these standards. And this is what has got us into trouble, and this is what has led to successive sessions of the Human Rights Council coming up with resolutions on Sri Lanka. We don't need to worry about that if we are conducting our human rights successfully. And unfortunately, the externalization of our problems have arisen because there has been a deficit in the observance of the rule of law in our country. The key to solving the problem in Geneva is here in Sri Lanka, and we have to use that key, and that can only be done by the people of Sri Lanka. And so I think in order to prevent the issue of human rights of Sri Lanka coming up in future, we have to ensure that our human rights here are set right. There is another international repercussion that may very well come up very soon. That is the elections in our closest and most powerful neighbor in India, where we are likely to see a change of government from the Congress-led NDA to a BJP-led coalition if the BJP does not get sufficient votes. And this can have negative consequences for Sri Lanka, particularly if the way in which Tamil Nadu is able to influence the decisions at the center, and the way in which the RSS or the extreme nationalist Hindutva parties are able to look on the issue of our relationship with China. And this has to be a very, very carefully watched election, and our foreign policy has to be very carefully geared, because not only is the rule of law in this country very vital in this issue because it affects the minority community, which of course has relationships with Tamil Nadu, but it also affects the perception of Sri Lanka internationally. So let me end with this by saying that I'm very glad that this initiative has been taken by the Bar Association, and I hope it will be continuing in order that the various sections of society of Sri Lanka will be united in ensuring that the rule of law is maintained in Sri Lanka in its democratic situation. Thank you.